18-year-old chess prodigy Gukesh Dommoraju is the 18th world champion after defeating Ding Liren in the final round of the 2024 World Chess Championships. Well, a hearty congratulations to him. Very, very well played, of course. Let's see how he did it with the black pieces. In this game, knight f3 was Ding Liren's first choice, very safe and solid approach. The reti defense. And after d5, what we've already seen, of course, in earlier rounds, Black says, well, you're not controlling the center. I will control said center that you're leaving behind. G3, White's idea is, of course, rapid development. They're going to castle and say, well, you've constructed a center, but I'm ready to attack it. C5, Black continues constructing said center. And after bishop G2, knight C6. At this moment, if White, Ding Liren, played castles or something slower, then E5 would happen and they'd enter a reverse King's Indian. And Ding didn't really want to give Gukesh the entire center. So therefore, d4 was played to stop this idea and at least limit the pawns in the center. Black might construct two, but of course, if these come off, the center will be sniped at from the bishop on g2. Therefore, e6, just defending in a lovely pawn chain. Maybe the aforementioned bishop now is a bit more of a block in its way, or a block that can't be as moved because there's a pawn chain. And castles, the aforementioned developing, rapid castling and development, and then striking back in a few moments. And after c takes d4, knight takes d4, we're in very much a reverse Grunfeld, known as a Zukertort opening, where White is striking through. Well, Black might want to try to force White to capture on c6, but the downside to that, despite strengthening the center, there will be a lot of pressure in red here, placed on the d5 square, and of course without having castled, it's at least two moves away, and then on the third move Black will finally castle, and a lot can happen in that time, especially with pressure being placed on the center. With, of course, queen a4 checks, or at least pinnings, well, that could have been an interesting position. As such, knight f6 could have been played to defend the center and start the castling process, but instead Gukesh played another move, knight ge7. And, well, the idea here is to support the knight on c6. And clearly, at this moment, Ding was in his preparation. But he went into the tank a little bit here, obviously having prepared against this and so on. But the bishop's now blocked. It's clearly looking perhaps to come out this way in some lines. Indeed, this would have been hot on Ding's mind. Is it coming to here and striking this way? Just changing preparations. Once again, showing Gukesh's absolutely sterling preparation for the match. Showing he comes up with new ideas in the most unlikely of places. And after about 13 minutes, c4 striking. There's nothing stopping White from doing this. The downside is, after knight takes d4, queen takes, and this is the difference between knight f6 and knight ge7, is that the knight on e7 can now, as it did, hop to c6 and force White's queen to move one way or the other. Now, Ding retreated to d1 after a further several minutes of thinking, but queen d3 is actually possible to play, but it's very hard to think this through over the board, and knight e5 would be the issue, but queen c2, knight takes c4, and specifically because of rook d1 combined with e4 pushes, well, once again, the king in the center, this is an example of a problem. Even knight d6 just solidifying, thereby e4, and this would have been very interesting and clearly what Gukesh would have been looking at in his preparation, which he very likely would have seen somewhere along here what would have been happening. Of course, instead of queen d3, queen d1 was played, stopping this, of course. It's worth noting, if captures, well, now the queen can sidestep again, saying, made you move your pawn, and now the d-file could be occupied. Very unpleasant, typical Catalan-esque, Grunfeld-esque position where this fiancatoed sniper over here really places pressure on c6. The pawn, of course, will be won back. There's no b5 is impossible because of this fork from said bishop. There's a few knight moves, but none of them really work. Just bishop f4, f4 in some positions, but certainly just develop an attack makes a lot of sense. If the knight moves here, we can even just retreat back and say, well, you've danced around and I've developed. And then you can imagine rook d1, knight d2 will win back this pawn with a lot of interest in various positions. So d takes c4 would not be in black's best interest. Best is to hold the fort. And d4, just, well, moving off of d5, but holding the pawn at the center with the pawn on d4 makes a lot of sense. We've seen this throughout the match. Pawns to d4 with black. Just stopping knight to c3, perhaps slowing down white's development. But once again, neglecting castling. So let's see how that works out. Pawn e3. And of course, Gukesh at this moment has not used much time. They're clearly in their preparation. But now with 20 minutes used by Ding, once again, typical moment in the match where Ding has used a bit of time to steady the ship and find out the best moves. And Gukesh now has to start thinking, and he spent 5 minutes or so on that move. Bishop c5, just starting to place pressure here. E takes d4. It's worth noting queen h5 is a very interesting moment, striking here. Placing pressure here and here. Of course, if ever g6, this will firmly weaken these dark squares in blue. And it's not possible now, of course, you would win the bishop. But for example, if queen to b6, solidifying this, well, even here, knight d2 is a viable idea, albeit very, very risky. You are sacrificing 2 pawns here and here, and this could have been an entirely different game. Black is better, perhaps, having won the pawn, but there's a lot of play striking at all these weak dark squares. And just to illustrate that, if, for example, g6 in a lot of variations, then issues will happen. Right now, this is why it's so beneficial. This bishop has to retreat, and perhaps then the rook can win back the pawn. Black will castle and ultimately be fine, but it would have been a very interesting dynamic approach. As it was, rather than, in this position, allow captures with the queen h5 move just seen, Ding, safety first, not wanting to rock the boat, played e takes d4. And after bishop captures, well, the knight now jumped to c3. It's worth noting, this looks tempting, but white will be having the fun here. 2 bishops. There's no real way to attack these pawns with this traffic jam over here. For example, if the queens come off, white is hugely helped. For example, castles. White's already doing incredibly well, just solidifying their control of the position. What is black doing? They can't move almost. Maybe knight a5, but then there's various issues with rook b5, c5, and in various orders. And there's actually no way to attack these pawns. So the bishop pair, combined with the rook pair, just doing a fantastic job. This bishop's stuck. This rook can't move without this bishop saying hello. And if this rook can't move either, then what can black move? And the answer is very little. This bishop will quickly come in and be very pleasant. So for that reason, back here, the bishop is never giving itself up. Even though it's double pawns, the dynamic play of the bishop pair will be too strong. For that reason, castle's kingside, just getting to safety. And knight to b5, showing, well, it is a threat, of course. Bishop takes c6 would remove the defender, and then the knight on d4 would drop. So it does have a direct threat. And bishop b6. Perhaps e5, giving up the bishop pair, solidifying in the center. For example, knight takes and e takes. Well, there is an Icelandic pawn, but it's potentially firmly blockaded. The bishop pair could be a nuisance. Perhaps this is what Gukesh was a little worried about, just giving up the bishop pair so easily. Even the bishop could come to here and strike at the d4 pawn. And, well, often you have to give part with this bishop to win said pawn. And if that happens, of course, it could get into opposite coloured bishop territory, which even a pawn down is more drawn than you'd think. For that reason, Gukesh decided to play bishop b6, just keeping his bishop pair, keeping chances alive for a win himself, but also just removing any threat this knight was doing. And of course, it also sets up for a6, starting to kick this knight away. And notably, if knight goes into d6, as we'll see in a few moments, well, it can't stay there too long. b3, helping develop. And a6, and this was Gukesh's point. Bishop drops back, happy with a trade of queens to justify and help the rook getting to the open d-file. So neither side wants to blink here in this tension. And now with knight d6, this would have been a bit too risky. Bishop d4, and they're on our rook and a1. Perhaps bishop takes c6, removing the defender. Bishop takes rook, bishop back to e4. The bishop pair being so active, and an octopus knight here. Places pressure, but, well, an illustrative line goes as follows. Queen c7, threatening rook d8. Bishop a3, defending, and of course hitting the bishop. And after bishop back to f6, bishop takes h7, a very nice move. This did not happen, but just illustrative. King takes, unlocking the defense, and unlocking the king's defense here as well. Knight e4, trying to remove the defender and attack. And after, for example, rook h8, knight takes, g takes, we have a draw by threefold repetition with this defending here. There's nothing for this king to do. There's no way to block the check. Even to g7 would make a difference. Of course, that did not happen, and back at this moment here, rather after a6 than going to d6, which could have seen such a variation. But sacrificing the rook is, of course, the exchange at least, is of course risky. Knight c3, much more safe and solid. Bishop d4 anyway, but this time, of course, the knight is not stranded on the d6 square. And so, bishop b2, opposing. Once again, bishop takes, bishop takes. Why do this to yourself? It's giving white a huge target. This would not have been a good approach by Gukesh. Of course, he came with better with e5 now, solidifying this bishop. Also unlocking this, if this bishop can get to anywhere here, it will look very, very good. The downside, of course, is this knight has this, but let's see what happened. Queen d2, now enabling this knight to hop into d5. Bishop e6, and you guessed it, knight to d5. And feel free to pause the video for this moment. What would you play as black here? Because Gukesh came with a very proactive counterattacking shot. And the move was b5. Striking and trying to undermine this pawn chain here. Of course, if the pawns come off, then a draw would suit both players, especially Gukesh perhaps, who with black would have been fine holding this draw, but, well, as we know, no such draw occurred. White called the bluff and captured, and possibly better would have been to trade here, try and force this forwards and counter strike both sides, undermining the knight's defense. Because, of course, if this captures, the knight drops. There's no bishop to skewer the queen to king. And, of course, this is the same problem white is having. If this pawn moves, then this knight would drop. So this would have been a dynamic approach. Still a little bit better for white, but holdable for black. This is a strong knight, after all. But instead, Gukesh, or Ding even, responded to Gukesh's b5 and captured. And bishop takes d5. Well, then, of course, b takes c6. And all of a sudden, we've won a pawn with white. This bishop might have to capture and capture, and the queen to a check. But after king g1, this is the point. The queen cannot capture here without losing potentially d4 here. And after captures, for example, if pin, then queen c3, and this is the point. The queen on c6 is undefended, and undefended pieces really, really matter. White actually won a piece here after queen c3. There's no way to win the bishop now. So that's a key point that Ding was using, essentially. All the way back here, the knight cannot be captured, safely at least, without a huge, potentially pawn-up position for white. Of course, Gukesh can capture, keeping things solid, avoiding all of this that we just saw. And at this moment, knight f4, using once again the tactical resource that, firstly, this is unlocked, this is still here, and maybe needing to be defended. So, after captures, this knight dropped. It was essentially a knight trade. But having forced this pawn to from e5 to f4, putting pressure, it's still 4 versus 3. And very likely this will occur on the board, so it will be 2 versus 3 here. And bishop takes b2, everything is liquidating. Very likely Ding had had enough. He wanted to trade things off. All of the lines we mentioned where things were happening, it was best, in Ding's opinion, it was best to trade things off. Rook b8, of course, this was under attack, defending the pawn. And rook ft1, queen b6, bishop retreat to f3, a very sensible move. And remarkably, both sides, this move 24 at present. This was white's 24th move. And Ding, of course, has 34 minutes to Gukesh's 65 minutes. So plenty of time relative to other rounds, of course, where Of course, both sides have been under the cosh with the clock. But at this moment, there's plenty of time. It's also simplifying. Both sides can semi-force positions where the pawns come off, a couple of pieces trade off, and then it would be very similar to yesterday's game, queen and rook, but with a bunch of pawns on the board. However, after captures, the aforementioned trade, b4, very nice positional move, just locking down on the 2 pawns here, nullifying the 2 versus 1, meaning that, well, if Ding wants to use these, he'll have to push. Of course, en passant, as I mentioned in earlier review videos, en passant means in passing. It's a one-time only move where when pushing 2 forwards past a pawn that's reached your half of the board in blue here, they can capture you in passing because the pawn moved over that square with its move. It's a one-time only move. If this doesn't happen now, for example, g5, g4, terrible moves, of course, then now en passant is not possible because it is a one-time only move when the pawn moves forwards too. And Gukesh did just that. He captured en passant and entered an endgame where after rook takes a3, there's 3 pawns for white, 3 pawns for black. Arguably, this b-pawn gives a small level of ambiguity, but ultimately with said pieces in the way, that's never moving. Briefly, if bishop takes b3, pins reign supreme. The queen will be lost if the bishop moves. If the queen was on b5, for example, then bishop c4 would perhaps save the day. It is not, and ultimately that would win. So bishop takes pawn is not possible, so Gukesh sensibly played the move g6, just prophylactically giving their king some space. Right now it's occupied, but that will change. And after queen d4, almost begging Gukesh to trade the queens, Gukesh declined and kept the queens on. He does have a substantial time advantage. Of course, 12 moves to move 40. I don't think either side was particularly worried about time. And b4, sort of saying, I insist, please take my pawn. I'll give you, but I will take your queen in process. And Gukesh did just that. Queen takes, rook takes. And at this moment, pretty much everyone was saying it's likely going to the tie breaks. At this moment, even chess.com's official statement was that very likely this game's going to tie breaks, and everyone was getting ready essentially for that eventuality. Now, if the pieces are traded off, bishop for bishop, and it just, for example, bishop d5, bishop takes, rook takes, once again we see a 3 versus 2. Perhaps with 2 rooks, there's some more wrinkles to look at, but ultimately just h5, and these rooks are too active to possibly be bettered by these 2 rooks. So that would have been a relatively simple draw overall. But rook a8 was chosen by Ding, and this keeps the bishops on, which, as we'll see, just kept a little bit of pressure on himself, really. And that bishop isn't particularly great in the corner, as we will see. And Gukesh has every right to play on, and indeed it, of course, paid off. g5, just solidifying his position. Ding could have gone into other endgames here, possibly slightly better versions of this, but he didn't. And so Gukesh, pawn up with bishops on the board, still has some pressure. Bishop d5, declined with bishop f5, of course. Once again, if this happens, this helps white's rook. h6 could happen, but ultimately, as we saw in round 13 just yesterday, the 3v2 is a relatively trivial draw. So keeping the bishops on very wisely with bishop f5 and rook c1, just centralizing, coming to an open file at least. King g7, rook c7 activating, bishop g6. Of course, Gukesh had been thinking about how to defend. Rook c4. Well, had these come off, Black would have still had some chances, but the problem is, in these positions, the king can sit on dark squares, and it potentially is very hard to break through nonetheless. So keeping the rooks on gives more winning chances for Black, and he, with Black, has won a pawn, so of course is perfectly happy to try and prove said win, very Magnus Carlsen-esque. Rook e1, and there's a bit of dancing around to the lead-up of move 40, where after bishop f3 and king h6, just defending, there followed king back to g1, just sidestepping off of the diagonal, potentially safety first, and Ding is essentially saying, I'm going to sit here forever, wait for you to push a pawn, Thereby, it will be a little bit vulnerable, and also, of course, the king can't come in if the rook is covering. Possibly some pawns get in the way, but of course, once again, if the pawns push, they likely trade off, and if you're trying to draw, certainly trading off the pawns is in your interest. Rook e6, rook c4, a little bit more dancing around, g4, bishop to d5, getting a tempo, rook d6, bishop e7, king g5, coming up, a check is possible, but it might invite f5, and so f3, meeting black where they are, rather than perhaps, if marked time, perhaps h4 could be a problem. As a result, f3 forces a trade-off, one way or the other. Of course, if captures, this pawn is defending here, and after bishop takes here, good luck pushing a h-pawn without mass trades. And so f5 instead, defending this g4 square. Captures and captures towards the center, just upgrading the pawn. It's better to have a passed f pawn in a lot of lines than perhaps a passed h pawn. For one thing, that bishop is firmly defending, and they're much harder to win in the rook endgames, so towards the center makes sense. Rook b4, defending, coordinating. Bishop f7, trying to reroute around. Of course, it's not doing much here now. It doesn't need defending as much. King f2, rook to a check. If the king came up, it would still be drawn, but you'd be asking for problems. This king can't comfortably get back to its g-pawn, and there's no need to risk this. For that reason, king back to g1 by Ding was played. King f6. Well, it's not going to come up. If, for example, it were to come up after this check by Ding, then the rook check again. It can't actually move forwards to here or here, and if it goes to the only safe square, then rook takes pawn, and of course, if you lose your extra pawn, there is no hope for a win there. And if the bishop blocks, as mentioned, you are very happy as black to trade, or white even, to trade off the bishops. You do not trade. Watch out for this. This is a losing king and pawn game. We'll look at that later. And if you keep the rooks on with white, this is a relatively simple draw, with your rook just defending one of the files, and your king can step up to g2 and defend g3. So for that reason, back at this moment with the check, the king did not step up to here. It went to g5, and keep watching, because after rook b4, bishop e6, rook a4, rook b2, the bishop stepped to a8. The first move that perhaps was an oddity. It could have gone pretty much anywhere else. For example, g2, just by its king. The king can always come to here, perhaps. The rook can't check and pin said king simultaneously. But instead, bishop a8 just gives it only one diagonal out and potentially asks for problems. Indeed, after king f6, stepping back now, potentially this could come up. There's less pressure. This is defended on f5, so perhaps the king could come to e3, where it could, of course, cause some problems with checks and such, and maybe then a favourable trade of the bishops with a check. Again, this bishop on this diagonal, just not the best placement, but there is activity from this rook. And so rook f4, king e5, and the idea of a fortress in chess is essentially sitting there, blockading from any hope of them entering, and white is doing just that. King e5 is knocking on the door, but this rook will sit here forever. This pawn defends f4, and once again, if this rook ever tries to attack here, you'll always have king g2, or perhaps to here. The rook checks back, you go back, and you guessed it, there's no way for one rook on its own without help from these guys to attack that g3 pawn. This bishop can always retreat, still has the option to, and so white is remaining active here. For example, bishop g2, rook b5, even rook to a check, doesn't really amount to anything. King f2 is safe, and it would have potentially fizzled out to a draw. However, after king to e5, at this moment, Ding Liren, the pressure got him. He's only got 10 minutes left versus Gukesh's 67 minutes, so a big time disparity there. Ding blundered with rook f2, and had he just stayed strong, kept the rook on f4, then this king can never enter in due to the fortress-esque structure that we have here. But now this forces trades. The rooks, of course, trade. And if the bishops could remain on the board, this would be very likely a draw. The king sits on the dark squares and the bishop moves around forever. But this is why the bishop on a8 is trapped. Bishop d5 forces the bishops off. Of course, it's now pinioned in the corner. So bishop takes d5, king takes d5. And after king e3, the rule of opposition rears its ugly head for Ding. And king e5, Ding actually resigned at this moment. But I'll play out the moves. If at this moment Ding were to retreat, which is the only move because they are in the opposition, losing the staring contest between these two kings. If they step back this way, then black can step up and continue pushing the king back using opposition. But they can even play f4. Of course, white's gone this way, and the action is over here. The king comes in first and rapidly gets to h2, and the pawn now queens. And if we go back to the critical moment there, if back to f2 to stop that, now f4 would actually draw. You need your king in front for black, in front of the pawn. So this is now a draw. The king sits on g2, and there are stalemate tricks that enable a draw. So at this moment, you step up with a diagonal opposition, and this wins once again. If the king comes back, once again, using the opposition. If the king sides this way, because you have a pawn helping you, and they do not really have a pawn helping them, you can outflank them. And now, once the king steps to the side, once again, this king continues its march forwards. For example, king g2, king e2, king h1, king f2, and after king h2, trying to win the opposition because we have a pawn helping us, black can afford to, and at this moment, white's king is forced away, h1 or g1, and the king would take on g3. This is why, back at this moment, rather fittingly, it ended here in an endgame with king e5 winning, because as we just saw, the king will one way or the other break through using the rule of opposition. So a very intense finish. The tension, the emotions for both players, absolutely sky high. Well, very well played to Ding Liren. Of course, he played absolutely stunning chess, winning round 12 to come back into it. Fantastically played game. And, well, Gukesh clinched it in the end, becoming the youngest and the 18th world chess champion. Very well played to him. And I'm sure we'll be seeing much, much more of him in the coming months and years. Hope you enjoyed that. Don't forget to like, comment, share, and subscribe. And see you soon. Stay tuned for more. Cheers.